Okay, so I'm going to do the introduction from here, which is going to be a bit strange, I think. So I'm going to stand up and do it to the camera with my back to you people.
We can see your face there. It's fine.
Oh, yeah.
But then I can't see my back. Okay. So first of all, let me introduce the series that this is part of. So this talk is part of the Mind in the Anthropocene series, and in this series we're looking at the concept of the Anthropocene, the concept that we've moved into an age where human activity is the definitive force shaping life on Earth, and was looking specifically at the implications of that for how we should think about ourselves. And in our case, we're interested in how that changes how we think about cognitive science. So we're very lucky to be joined today by Professor Mark Maslin, who's, I think, the perfect speaker to speak to this this question that we have. So Mark Maslin is a professor of Earth System Science at University College London. He's the author of at least 8 popular books, most recently, How to Save Our Planet, The Facts. And he's also one of the leading voices on defining what the Anthropocene is. So in particular, some work that he did with Simon Lewis, a Nature paper in 2015 on defining the Anthropocene is one of the most important papers in the field, I think it's fair to say. That was subsequently expanded into a book on the human planet. Mark has also written extensively on human evolution and the impact of climate events and climate change on human evolution. So we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Mark. So when you're ready.
Oh, thank you very much, Ed, and thank you for such a kind introduction. So can everybody see that? Is that nice and clear? Good, I'm seeing some nods. Right, so I'm going to start off with discussing how large is our environmental impact, because I think it's really important when we are talking about the Anthropocene that we have a common knowledge of how huge humanity's impact is on the planet. Because if humans are a new superpower, then we can actually go to the geological record and define a new epoch, the Anthropocene, but only if we feel that we have the same impact as, say, a meteorite impact or plate tectonics. So I'm going to use planetary boundaries. So this was the last paper published by Will Stephan and colleagues in Science. What they did was they took key boundaries. There's 9 boundaries about the Earth and the environment, starting off with everything that we know about climate change, atmosphere, land use change, fresh water, biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, aerosol loading, ozone, and the one I really love, novel entities, which is not quantified. That's because we know in most universities there are strange new organisms being sort of like evolved by humans and by scientists, and they'll get into the world at some point and we have no idea what impact they'll have. So I'm going to pick on geochemical flows, nitrogen, climate change, and biosphere, just to give you some ideas of how big our impact is. So if we look at the top left, half the nitrogen that is fixed from the atmosphere at this moment in time is done by humans, the Haber-Bosch process to make ammonia, and that ammonia is used mainly for fertilizer to feed the world's growing population. Top right, we have increased carbon dioxide by about 50% since the Industrial Revolution, and increased methane by about 50% since the Industrial Revolution. Huge change compared with the last million years. If we take the whole of the land's surface, including Antarctica, humans use over 25% of the land for our settlements, our farming, and our extraction of resources. And some people have argued that we may be in the 6th mass extinction. Now, as a geologist, I'd say we're nowhere near that, because you need to have a good 20% of life of species wiped out before we can call it a mass extinction. But we have increased the background extinction rate by about 100-fold compared with historic times, and we could be increasing that 1,000, 10,000-fold in the future with climate change and greater impacts. So we move more soil, rock, and sediment each year than is transported by any other natural processes combined. Damn the actual geologists. We have made more concrete. We have made huge amounts of concrete that can cover the whole world's surface in a layer 2 millimeters thick and include the ocean. Damn the engineers. And we make over 300 million tons of plastic each year, which can be found in every ocean. Damn the chemists. There's even been a white plastic bag found at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, 7 kilometers deep in the Northwest Pacific. The only issue is it didn't have Walmart or Tesco's actually, or Karstadt on there. Otherwise, at least we could have blamed a supermarket chain. And this is the killer fact. We take the weight of land mammals at this moment in time. 30% is humans. There's 7.9 billion of us. 67% of that weight is our livestock and our pets. Only 3% are the wild animals that David Attenborough and others go around filming for our entertainment on a Sunday night on the sofa. Just 3% of that weight is now wild animals. So I would say welcome to the Anthropocene, and this was the strapline nature paper and the beautiful cover by Alberto. And basically, the Anthropocene is a slice of Earth's history during which people have become a major geological force. But the argument is, of course, when did it begin? So this is where we enter the great Anthropocene controversy, which echoes other controversies back through history, because geologists love to fight about their terminology. So this is the geologic timescale. This is to geologists what the periodic table is to chemists. As you can see, the whole of the 4.5 billion years of Earth history is actually split up into meaningful chunks. Now, each one of these splits is where something major happens, either in the climate or the biology of Earth. So if you see the change between the blue, the Mesozoic, to the Cenozoic in the yellow on the left-hand side, that's 66 million years. That huge change is because of the meteorite impact in Mexico and the wiping out of non-avian dinosaurs. Yes, my youngest daughter idea that chickens may actually be descended from dinosaurs. She just thinks that's wrong on so many levels. So in the boring bit, this is the top bit, the sort of beige and yellow. We're in the Cenozoic era, of course, because of the wiping out of the dinosaurs. We're in the Quaternary period defined by the great ice ages. But strangely enough, we're in the Holocene epoch. And these lines are GSSPs, or golden spikes. And I show you a picture of a golden spike because they literally used to put it in their type section around the world. And geologists wonder why they kept disappearing. So the Holocene is an odd one because it's defined at the end of the last ice age. It's the warmest period at the right at the end. And weirdly enough, it's defined by ice cores instead of sediments. The other strange thing is the beginning of the Holocene is exactly like the beginning of every other interglacial for the last 8 or 9 cycles. It's only in the middle of the Holocene does weird things start to happen. We have a geological definition which seems to not fit with the rules. Top that off, the International Union of Geological Sciences announced that we are in the Megalanian age. So the Holocene Working Group have basically split up the last 10,000 years into the Greenlandian, North Cripian, and the Megalanian. And the Megalanian is defined by a mega drought in the Middle East, which is also found in India and China about 4.2 thousand years ago, except it's not found in North America, it's not South America, so it's not particularly a global signal. So yes, rules, and then let's just make it up. But you didn't hear me say that. So welcome to the Time Wars. There is an Anthropocene working group, which basically has about 30 people on it. There's a Holocene working group, which has about 16 people on it. And basically these little geology committees try to define the whole of time. And by the way, I apologize, the culturally Pacific police box on the left-hand side, but I'm sure some of you can tell the rest what that means. Simon and I came through this, and we realized by having done our review, we started to interpret history through our environmental impact. And at the end of the book, Simon literally has an office on my corridor, came to my room, sat down with me and said, I think we've reinterpreted the whole of history. And I went, yes, we have. So I produced the diagram. So it seems from our research that you can define the whole of humanity into 5 major societies: hunter-gatherer, agriculturalists, mercantile capitalists, industrial capitalists, and consumer capitalism. Now, don't get me wrong, in each of these major societies, there is evolution and change. So for example, during agriculturalism, there's the invention of language, of writing, of money, and lots of different forms of government. But each one of these is defined by a revolution: domestication, European expansionism, industrial revolution, and the Great Acceleration. And one of the things with each one of these steps is that the population of the planet grew massively. The amount of energy that each individual uses increases massively. The amount of knowledge we have is exponential, but also so is the global environmental impact that we have. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through these stages just to give you some idea of where perhaps where the Anthropocene could sit. So stage 1, this is hunter-gatherers and the megafaunal extinctions. Humans dispersed across the whole world, starting about 60,000 years for Homo sapiens 2.0. There's early migrations out, but this is the species, which is ourselves, who went out and basically slaughtered the megafauna wherever. We were hunting mammoths to extinction. We were hunting flightless birds on islands. But we didn't really have much impact apart from that slaughter. But then we had the revolution at the end of the last ice age, where we have early agriculture and the age of, and the social scientists, not to be outdone, have called this the Plantationocene. So agriculture developed independently in about 9 to 14 places, depending on which papers you read. So that includes Central and South America, West Africa, the Middle East, China, and Papua New Guinea. And this conflict between hunter-gatherers and agrarian society has been going on for 13,000 years. We still have hunter-gatherers, but they are on the worst lands and have been marginalized. And also, I'm showing you this extended Darwinian view, because of course, if you think about it, you went from being a hunter-gatherer when you would spend, about 30% of your time actually collecting food, to agrarian society, where you spend most of your time working on the land and actually not getting the same wide variety of diet. Wouldn't switch if I was you. Progress trap. Now, the age of empire, there was a slow increase in environmental impacts. And if we look, we have the Mongolian Empire, Islamic, Mali, Southern African, Incas, Mayans, and X. You'll notice there is no European empire. And that's something really interesting to come back to, considering the world is dominated by Europeans. So early humans did have a major impact. So if we look at methane and CO2 from the atmosphere, from the ice cores, we can see the blue is what normally happens in an interglacial, which is methane and CO2 start high, and then during the interglacial, they drop down, and CO2 hits that magic number about 240 parts per million, and descend into the next ice age. So about 6,000 years ago, we start to increase CO2, and about 5,000 years, we start to increase methane in the atmosphere. Now, it seems that the work by Bill Ruderman has shown that A lot of this is due to deforestation for CO2. With methane, it's cattle and also the explosion of wet rice agriculture in the Far East, China, and other countries around that region. And so therefore, we have huge change. And lots of my co-workers have actually shown quite clearly that moving away from that 240 meant that early farmers actually did prevent us going into the next ice age. So globalization of humanity in the Capitalocene is stage 3. This is European expansionism. So 1492, Columbus arrives in the Americas. He calls it the West Indies because, of course, he's actually in the wrong place. And again, I refuse to use the word discovered or basically found, because, of course, there are already something like 60 million people living in the Americas quite happily ignorant of Columbus. And the key thing here is this keys off a period of global species exchange. So we have here just shipping logs of 19th and 18th century ships. And Benjamin Schmidt has very kindly put this all very nicely together. And actually, there's no map underneath. It is just the shipping logs. This is the huge exchange. So the collision of the new and old world created the Columbian Exchange, which is a very nice word for something that was incredibly traumatic. So what did we get? We got things like maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, peanuts, squash, pumpkins, tomatoes, peppers, avocados, pineapples, cocoa, tobacco, and quinine, a medicine that was very useful against malaria. What did we give back? Wheat, sugar, banana, rice, grapes, horses, pigs, cattle, goats, sheep, chickenpox, measles, typhus. So the big problem is that firstly, it was the genetic remixing of human population. So the population of the Americas had been isolated for about 13,000 years from the African Europeans and Asians. It's the start of colonization and global slavery. It's the irreversible movement of species, crops, animals, and diseases. And I'll give you an example of animals. So at the moment, the dominant earthworm in North America is European. The reason being is the American earthworm waits for the leaf litter to decay and then it'll eat it. The European one's a bit more dynamic. It'll dive up into the leaf litter, grab some of it, pull it down, munch on it, and start the whole process. Now, the idea of repatriating every single earthworm from North America back to Europe is not possible. And the same with actually, if you think about sort of the change of sort of earthworms. So as I was saying, the problem with first contact with Europeans with the sort of New World was it brought all of those diseases with them. Now, about 10% of the world's population died within 100 years. So a detailed paper by Alex Koch and others showed that 56 million people died in the Americas within 100 years of first contact. The reason being is because they had no natural immunity to these diseases, and also the diseases came in waves. So we started with, of course, sort of typhus, which got over there very quickly, measles as well, and then as improved, then actually smallpox made it across as well. There are reports by conquistadors who basically say that they got to cities where everybody was already dead. Now, the interesting thing is this was such a trauma that all these people died who were farmers. What happened was the forest and the savanna grew back, and we can see that there is a CO2 dip. CO2 was sucked out of the atmosphere as this was regrowing and created what we called the Orbis spike, the CO2 drop, centered on 1610. And this is where, again, sort of like Simon and I suggested, perhaps this trauma, the great dying of the indigenous peoples of America, should be the point where the Anthropocene started. Because it starts many other things. So it changes our sort of view of the world. So after 1492, we have the Copernicus revolution. Suddenly the Earth is not the center of the solar system, actually the sun is. And as we know, it then gets worse, that we're then part of a much larger universe. So our special place is lost. And I love this sort of quote by René Descartes. He said, "In this great city where I am living, with no man apart from myself not being involved in trade, everyone is so intent on his profit that I could spend my whole life without being seen by anywhere." And this is basically the money that was being driven through this whole sort of like age of empire. Interestingly enough, he's talking about Amsterdam at the height of the Dutch Empire. So the Capitalocene, or the age of slavery, we have to remember, with the decimation of the population of the Americas, then we had to take people across as workers. So 14 million West Africans were ripped from their homeland and transported across to South America, Central and North America. Unfortunately, only 11.5 million of them actually made the crossing safely. Huge trauma and movement. So maybe we are in the Industrial Revolution, and maybe it's the Technocene. Perhaps this is the start of the Anthropocene. Of course, the key thing here is, of course, coal. And it's interesting because sort of the reason why coal became a major dominant fuel source is because the UK had deforested itself, partly for agriculture, but then also to build ships to keep the evil French during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, the interesting thing about the Industrial Revolution is it was not inevitable and only occurred once in one location, the Midlands of the United Kingdom in 1840. It then spreads like a virus across the whole of Europe, makes it to Ukraine by the 1880s. It also infects USA, Canada, and Japan, and is still spreading across the rest of the world today. So why? Why Europe? Because in the 10th century, if somebody said you've got to go back to the 10th century, you'd probably choose sort of like the Persian Empire or China, because nice, civil. You would not choose the cesspit of Europe. And it comes down to geography. So if you think about the geography of China, it has a very simplistic coastline. It has mountains to the sort of west of it. It has desert to the north, and it has two rivers that split it up into upper, middle, and lower China. Easy. Europe, complicated coastline, really annoying islands like my own country that really doesn't think they're part of the mainland. And of course, you have a mountain range in the middle, which causes radial rivers. So you get all these fragmented lands, which then becomes kingdoms and principalities. And if you look between the 15th and the 17th century, maybe into the 18th century, 90% of the time, the powers in Europe were at war with each other. Now, of course, what that does is it drives technology to, by the point of the 1750s, ships could sail all around the world with pinpoint accuracy. They could fire cannonballs over a mile away on a target with ease. That basically technology allowed the expansion of European countries. It allowed them to take over and colonize, and also to strip other countries of their wealth and create huge amounts of money, which drove progress, industrialization, and science. Also, with the Industrial Revolution came a change in our thinking with the emergence of socialism. So, of course, if you're working in a factory, you got less sunlight, you got less nutrition, it was not good for you. And Marx, one of the great economic thinkers, really thought about what this revolution meant. But, okay, nothing much happens. So CO2 doesn't really change during the Industrial Revolution. There's an uptick when we have Industrial Revolution 2, when electricity becomes the dominant driving force driven by power from coal burning. And then acceleration after 1950, where CO2 really takes off. So that gets me to stage 5, which is the Great Acceleration, Neoliberalism, and the Cthulhuocene. Yes, there is a Cthulhuocene. So everything of the modern world was defined in 1944 and 45 by the Allies at a number of conferences. So the Bretton Woods Conference set out the way that money would work in the world and basically set the US dollar as the international currency of exchange. And $35 was the price of 1 ounce of gold as the gold standard. It set up the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and then later the United Nations was set up, all to make sure that countries did not economically fail as they did between the First and Second World War to secure global stability. And look at the success. I mean, the energy consumption from 1950 to present day has increased massively. So is the population. There is over 3.5 billion extra people today than 1950, and we feed most of them. But we then had a period of state regulation and control of that capitalism, which seemed to work very well. But then a group of economists in the 70s realized that perhaps they could take their training wheels off. You know, markets knew best. We should get rid of state control. And this was neoliberalism. And I love this quote by the International Monetary Fund. The last generation of economic policies may have been a complete failure. And of course, the cartoon that says, to the poor of this world, we say, remember, we are counting on you to keep us. Now, I don't blame the economists. They really honestly thought that by lifting up the whole economy, they were going to drag the bottom up more than ever before, except that hasn't happened. What has happened is that we still have a world in which we have 7 million children that die needlessly every year of preventable diseases and starvation. We have 825 million people going to bed feeling hungry every night. That's up 20 in the last 5 years. And we have enough food for 11 billion people. So it's not lack of food, it's lack of money. And 1 billion people still do not have access to clean, safe drinking water. So is it the lack of money stopping us saving the world? So admittedly, I had to say I've put GDP growth for the world from the 1600s, but as you can see, it's a straight up line. It's about $88 trillion that we earn every year now as world. And I'll use the UK as an example. GDP year, even though we're just coming out of pandemic, was $2.76 trillion. So the question is, why are there poor people? And as I point out, poverty is a political decision. So just to really ram this home, this is Oxfam's sort of wonderful illustration of neoliberalism, which is how many of the world's richest billionaires own the same as the poorest half of the world's population, which is about 3.8 billion people now. In 2010, it's 388. By 2015, it dropped to 62. And by 2019, 26 people. So basically the number of people in the actual room that I'm looking at, that is about the number of billionaires that own so much wealth. It's the same as the bottom half of the world. Okay, just let that sink in. Other numbers have suggested may even during the pandemic got as low as 8, but you know, 26. So this is Donna Haraway, who's a brilliant feminist, philosopher, credible thinker, and she argues that it's capitalism and particularly neoliberalism, which is this sort of like entity beyond madness, a bit like H.P. Lovecraft's sort of like monsters, that is actually consuming our resources and consuming our lives. I have to admit that I spell Cthulhuocene correctly because I am a fan of Lovecraft, whereas Donna Haraway has a whole wonderful paragraph of why she spells it differently. but I just thought that would be an interesting way of thinking about the Anthropocene in a different way. So to come to sort of more of a conclusion, why does defining the Anthropocene matter? So I think it's because we need that sixth mode of human society. We have to learn from history. We have to understand that we have to actually break all the rules of history. So in this post-capitalism, and by the way, post-capitalism can be super capitalism. It can be, I know, neo-capitalism. It can be anything you want. It isn't anti-capitalism. It's just something that's different consumer capitalism we have now. But to do that, we firstly know that population is being stable, is stabilizing, stabilized about 10 billion. We're the first species ever that we know to control its own population. And that's, of course, due to women's education to secondary school level and above. We know that we're going to need a lot more energy because we need to lift billions of people out of energy poverty around the world. Knowledge, well, I think Pandora's box is truly open with the internet of all things. Knowledge is actually never going to reduce. Actually, the only thing we need to do is actually understand what is fake knowledge and what is true knowledge. But the one thing we do have to do is reduce our environmental impact and actually perhaps even repair the damage we've already done. So why is the Anthropocene so important? Well, if you think about it, science for the last 500 years has actually made us feel really insignificant. You start off with the Copernicus revolution. You now have astronomers telling us that sort of like star is in an unfashionable end of the universe and actually is quite small and insignificant compared with most stars, and is one of 10 to the 23 stars in the whole of our galaxy. Yeah, that makes us feel really, really small and insignificant. And then you have, of course, Darwin and the biologists getting involved, going, well, you know that special place, plants, animals, man, and I apologize, it was man in the Victorian times, angels, God. Well, no, actually just a ultra-social naked ape who's really good at basically working in teams. Okay, however, if we accept the Anthropocene and we accept that we are the new geological superpower on the planet, it means that the environment and the evolutionary destiny of life on Earth is under our control. The only place that we know that life exists in the universe. So we go from zero to hero. The most important thing is that power that we have is different. It's not like a meteorite or plate tectonics. It's not one directional. If we decide, we can actually change our impact. We can reforest vast areas. We can clean up the oceans of plastics. If we choose, we have choice. We have self-determinism. I also put a big warning out here. This is work by Catherine Yosef, who I recommend her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes. And I warn you about white geology. Look at the committee, old white men. After this was taken, they did actually suddenly throw a couple of women on there just to make sure that they weren't accused of mansplaining. But again, the key thing that I always point out is every single one of the revolutions that I pointed out, the indigenous, the vulnerable, and the poor always suffer most. And in some cases, in catastrophic ways. So therefore, when we're looking at the Anthropocene and defining it, we need to think about the future, how to actually make sure everybody's included in the revolution, not just the very wealthy or those 26 billionaires. So there's an argument about whether there is a good or bad Anthropocene. We're in the Anthropocene, and therefore we can choose what the Anthropocene is. So I'm literally going on a train to Paris tomorrow. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite look as green and gorgeous as this, but that could be the future of all our cities. Or it could be New York, and I love this picture. It's from one of my favorite films, You Originally Apes, with Charlton Heston bashing down onto sort of like the sand, going, we burnt it all to heck. And the biggest question that we have is, can prosperity, well-being be decoupled from environmental damage? And I think that we need to consider the Anthropocene as 4 challenges: climate change, environmental degradation, global poverty, and global security. And the last one has been thrown in stark contrast in the last few months, because we have a major land war in Europe, which we were never expecting. So I think all of these challenges can only be understood and tackled if we understand our own history and why they exist in the first place. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, the Human Planet is out. It's a Penguin, you can buy it, or this is the Yale version. They've got a paperback version that has just come out this spring. And How to Slave the Planet, Our Facts has actually 3-4 chapters at the beginning, very short, punchy ones that basically give all of this lecture in single sentences. I hope that has helped and stimulated some discussion.
So, thank you, Mark, for an excellent talk. So I guess we can have a bit of a question and answer session now. It's probably best if people come up here and ask the question, because the microphone is here. I guess I can get us started. Can I ask you, Mark, to comment on what the status of this Anthropocene debate is that you've presented to us? So do you think, so this committee of geologists, of 30 geologists that are in charge of deciding where the Anthropocene starts, are they close to coming up with a definition? Are we ever going to get a definition?
Okay, so yes, so the geologists on the Anthropocene working group made a decision a couple of years ago that it's post-1950, which Simon and I and many others find deeply unscientific, because what they've done is they've chosen the actual answer and they're now basically collating the evidence to show where that is. So this autumn, I believe that they will be presenting their results. They will be presenting their defined layer where they want to actually say this is where it all changed. It will be post 1950. It basically feeds into the sort of like the climate change debate. It fuels this sort of like it's the American empire type argument, which I think, and many of us think, misses longer term processes and actually greater traumas that have occurred in the past where the world really radically shifted. But they have already decided that, and I got to that point of, I don't really care what the definition is, just as long as there is, because then we can just spend all our time telling them they're wrong. It'd be great.
Do you want to come up here?
Yeah, I can come up.
Introduce yourself.
Yes. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm Nicole from the North Sea Working Group. So I think in this presentation, you've called us to the precipice. You kind of call out this current system and then you tie it to important geological changes. And I want to know from you, and maybe this will turn into a two-part question, what do you want the rhetorical outcome of acknowledging the Anthropocene to be on this next step in human society? If we think back to that diagram where you portray these 5 different steps of energy consumption, why are you spending your time sharing the Anthropocene with us?
Okay, so the first one is, I think that if we all have this view that as a species, we are having a planetary effect, it changes the way we think about the world and ourselves. And I think that's something that we need to change. So each generation thinks very differently about the world, interacts with technology in a different way. And what we need to be able to do is not just think as individuals, as members of our clan, members of our country, we need to think as a global species. And I think that's going to be the next revolution in our thinking. We have to think globally. So that's the first thing. That's why I think the Anthropocene is a really important topic. I also think that the Anthropocene is important because it's not climate change. Okay, I am a climate change expert. I understand the frustrations of my colleagues, but I think that we miss, by just focusing on climate change, we miss pollution, extinctions, deforestation, and all the other impacts we're having on the planet. And therefore, I think we need a much more holistic approach to human impact. What I hope will change, that's another key thing, is then if you have that view, then your decision-making tools should be different. So again, it should be, if you're a politician, you should think about how does that affect the local people, the country, the planet. It should be, you should be ticking boxes. And if the policy is basically good for your people, good for the country, but bad for the planet, then you don't do it. And I think we need that sort of like different way of thinking. There are so many different political systems in the world at the moment. Actually being able to pick one and say, that's the one that's going to work, problematic. But I and many other people are very vocal about that the global systems of governance we have are 70 or 80 years out of date. And therefore, we really do need to rethink those and make them much more representative and actually make them much more sensitive to current situations, not how the global politics was post-Second World War.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any more questions from the room?
Christian, can we ask questions from the virtual space? This is Søren speaking.
Sure. Yeah, go for it. I can hear you better.
Yeah, okay.
It's just a quick question. You said that poverty is a political decision. Could you comment on that?
So, absolutely. So there is no fundamental reason in economics that there are poor people. If you don't want poor people, you basically change the politics. So, for example, if we look at the GDP of Denmark, UK, United States, okay? Per head of population, Denmark's last. Guess what? UK's next, and USA is actually ahead per person. How that wealth is distributed within the countries is the other way around. So there's more extreme poverty in the US than there is in the UK, and there's more extreme poverty in the UK than there is in Denmark, okay? So we have soup kitchens. We have basically food banks in the UK because we have made a political decision of how to redistribute wealth. So therefore, poverty is purely a political decision, how you distribute the wealth of a country. Søren.
Yes, okay. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm doing research in consumer culture. So my question to you is whether the biggest challenge to this transition that you're talking about might be that unless we are very rapid and very good at solving this decoupling question that you raised between environmental damage and wealth, that has also globalized is the consumer capitalist imaginary, and we have approximately, depending on where you put the limit, we have somewhere between half and 3/5 of the global population that are not really part of sort of contemporary consumer capitalism, but they all know the imagery and the imaginary and the lifestyles that go together with it. Mm-hmm. So unless we can provide that part of the global population with something that does not make them feel once again the people that must pay for the transition, as you mentioned so clearly, you know, every time it's the bottom of the pyramid that pays the transitions. They're the ones who are deprived from everything that we have had. You understand the question?
Yeah. So I think this is a two-pronged approach. The first thing is we have to change the way we think about being human and being happy and consuming. Again, we have been sold for the last 70 odd years the view that if we buy stuff, we're happy. And what was really interesting, I think, with the pandemic is people realized that the things that really make them happy is being able to hug people, being able to see their friends and family, and being able to actually go out and be ultra social. That's what we do. Having 10 t-shirts or the designer glasses or whatever doesn't necessarily make you happy. I'm no happier than my parents were, okay? And I'm a lot better off. So I think we need to understand that and break that sort of like imagery in some shape or form. And therefore, once you have this new view of how it is to actually be happy and part of a community, then we can translate that to other people as they are rapidly developing in the rest of the world. So we actually have this sort of like more community feel to being human than this individualistic sort of like, I've got loads of stuff. How we do that? No idea. Absolutely no idea. But again, I think that's what we need to do. It's cannot consume as we are. And I also think that we have to realize that it's only a small population that's actually making most of the consumption. So if we look at, say, carbon, 50% of the carbon footprint of the world is consumed by about the richest 10%. And that's the richest 10% across all countries. So it's not just particular countries. So for example, in the US, it is the very wealthy that does most of the actual carbon footprint, same in China, same in India. And so therefore, it's that ultra rich that is causing the issues. And unfortunately, I hate to say that, but probably most people on this call are in that top 10%.
Right. Thank you.
That's okay. Pleasure.
So hi, Mark. Sune Steffensen from DS2. And I had a really bad timing because I had a question and then I raised my hand and then you kind of answered that question already. But I'll phrase it anyway.
Yeah.
So and perhaps try to elaborate a bit on it. So my question is, I think it's a wonderful talk and I really enjoyed it, and you make it clear that with the Anthropocene, there's like knowledge about the Anthropocene is a necessary component in changing where we're heading right now. But my thought was, but it's surely not a sufficient part of what it needs to make that change that we need to do. And I was thinking to ask you to elaborate a bit on, so what do we need in addition to that? And then you replied, you have no idea. And I think that is like the state of the art where we're at right now. We simply have no idea how to do that. So I was thinking, because it does then take a bit of imagination, a bit of boldness, a bit of something that we don't really know what is to move in that direction. And so perhaps my question is that I'd like to ask you to comment a bit on, so how on earth do we do that?
Okay, so huge question.
Thank you.
So the problem is, if we look at history, the biggest problem is whenever there is massive change and there is revolution and things change, it's usually incredibly traumatic. Okay, so Second World War, sort of like massive wars within sort of like Europe of expansionism. So there's part of me that goes, how do we change the status quo gently without having those traumas? But history says that actually those sort of traumas, and what is, I think, really noteworthy is we are getting extremes at the moment. So if you look at politics in most countries, it's gone from being middle, we're getting polar opposites. We're getting sort of like major sort of like wars happening. So perhaps we're in this stage of starting the revolution and changing. I also think that we need leaders. We need inspirational leaders that will actually use crises and change them. One of my greatest frustration is the 2008 financial crash. Gordon Brown in the UK, President Obama in the USA could have completely changed the system. Everybody was begging them to save the world. We were going into financial meltdown, this is going to be awful, etc. They could have sat down, and if they had desk drawer plans, like they had during the Second World War, and just brought them out and went, we've planned for this. Now, banks, you are now going to be nationalized, or you're going to do this. You're now going to actually provide money for every single person under universal basic. You could do radical things and everybody go, oh, thank you for saving us. That's when you change things. So I think that we need leaders who are brave enough to use crises to change things. It's interesting that sort of like the awful invasion of Ukraine is basically making Europe realize that they have to go green much faster. Yeah, forget about saving the planet or anything. This is about getting themselves off Russian gas and geopolitics. So I think it's leveraging these crises, and we haven't had a decent, I would say, global leader for some time. And I think that's, unfortunately, individuals are what do change the world.
Thank you.
I think we'll make this the last question.
Hi, Mark.
So no pressure then. So no pressure. No pressure. Last question.
No pressure. And it's disappointingly broad, actually, but I think it's important anyway. We're here in the Danish Institute for Advanced Study, which is Denmark's leading centre for interdisciplinary research. And you're a professor of Earth system science, but throughout your talk, you've taken us through the long history of all these developments. You've taken us through some social aspects, and you've really reinforced the importance of engaging with policy. For you, is an interdisciplinary approach the only way in which we can really truly understand the impact of the Anthropocene?
A short answer, absolutely. The biggest problem that I have is that people pigeonhole me. Okay, I'm a geologist. I'm sort of like an earth system scientist. I'm a climate scientist. However, I actually think that what we are returning to is what were the natural sciences. So we therefore can actually engage with all the different subject areas. The problem is, and as I'm sure all of you are aware, interdisciplinary work is hard. We use different languages. We have different value systems. We publish differently. We work in different ways. And I'll give you a classic example. So I published with lawyers, engineers, medics, even with another geographer. So Andrew Barry is a professor of human geography. He comes from the science technology studies background. That might help tell you something about him. And we decided to write a paper on the Anthropocene. Except we had these discussions and we agree on nothing, absolutely nothing. Everything I'd say, he would disagree with, and vice versa. So how did we actually come to write a paper? We wrote it as a dialogue. So this is in geo, and sort of like we have a introduction, and then literally it's him, me, him, me, him, me. And we do take chunks out of each other. I mean, I basically sort of like lambast social science for sort of like deconstructionism and basically sort of like not actually producing any solutions ever. But it was a free way, and students love it because they can pick it up and go, oh, it's not settled. And I think sometimes we need different ways of actually working together. So your institute is absolutely fantastic, where you bring people from very different backgrounds and you just go, right, this is a problem. How does the economist sort of look at it? How does the social scientist look at it? How does the scientist? And I have to say, this is also one of the big issues with climate change scientists. We are very logical, okay? And actually my colleagues just go, well, why don't you just stop using fossil fuels? It's like, yes, but have you looked at all the social consequences? No, we just should stop. It's like, okay, can we? So sometimes you have to actually be very gentle with people and actually take them on a journey to actually understand how complex the real world is. Does that help? Was that better than absolutely?
Yes, it is. Yeah, thank you so much.
I think that's a good place to end. I think that's an endorsement of Diaz, which is certainly a good place for us to end. Yeah.
You can pay me later, Ed.
So thanks again, Mark.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Take care, guys.